The night my husband came home and told me his mother had been moved into our spare bedroom without asking me. I thought that was the worst thing that could happen to us. I had no idea that 11 months later, I'd be sitting in a hospital bed in Vancouver General, holding my newborn daughter against my chest, waiting for my in-laws to walk through that door, and watching that door stay closed. Let me back up. My name is Simone. Wait, no. I keep wanting to introduce myself the way I used to, back when I thought I knew who I was. Back when I had a husband who loved me, in-laws who called me daughter, and a family that felt solid. My name is Adela. I'm 31 years old. I grew up in Burnaby. I went to SFU. I met my husband in my second year of a business program, and I spent the next 8 years building what I thought was a life. His name doesn't matter anymore. I'll call him what he became to me in the end. My husband. Nothing more. We got married in the summer, a small ceremony in Garibaldi Park. My grandmother flew in from Winnipeg and cried the whole time. My father-in-law gave a toast that made everyone laugh. My mother-in-law held my hands before I walked down the aisle and said, "You're ours now. Don't ever forget that." I thought she meant it warmly. I stored that memory like something precious. The first few years were normal. Good even. We had a condo in East Van. My husband worked in commercial real estate. I worked in financial planning at a downtown firm. We talked about kids in the abstract, the way young couples do. Someday, maybe, when the timing is right. His parents lived in Surrey and we saw them every few weeks. Sunday dinners, the occasional long weekend at their place in the Okanagan, I liked them. I thought they liked me. My grandmother came to stay with us one winter when she had trouble with her knee. She was 78, sharp as she'd ever been, but living alone in a Winnipeg apartment wasn't working anymore. She stayed for 6 weeks, and in those 6 weeks, something shifted in me that I didn't fully understand until much later. She told me things. About my grandfather, about the land her parents had owned in Manitoba, about money she had put aside that she said was for the grandchildren who show up when it matters. She said it lightly, like a joke. I laughed. I didn't think anything of it. She went home. My husband and I found out I was pregnant that March. I want to tell you I was happy. I was. But I was also scared in the way you're scared when something wonderful happens and some small part of you already knows it's going to cost you something. I don't know how to explain that feeling. I just know I had it. The pregnancy was straightforward until it wasn't. I had a good second trimester. I felt strong. I was working until late in my third trimester, eating well, walking along the seawall most mornings. My mother-in-law called every week to ask how I was doing. She sent a package with a hand-knit blanket and a card that said she couldn't wait to be a grandmother. I put the blanket in the nursery and felt, for a moment, like everything was exactly as it should be. Then my grandmother called and told me she'd updated her will. She said it so casually. We were talking about something else, a documentary she'd watched, and she just mentioned it. I changed a few things, sweetheart. Wanted you to know. You've always been the one who checks on me, the one who shows up. Your cousins, they're busy with their lives. I understand, but I wanted things to be right. I asked her what she meant by right. She said she'd left the majority of her estate to me. The house in Winnipeg, which she'd owned outright, some savings, some investments she'd made quietly over the years that I hadn't known about. It's not a fortune, she said, but it's something. It should help you and that baby. I thanked her. I told her I loved her. I didn't think about what that phone call would set in motion. 2 weeks before my due date, I was driving home from a prenatal appointment on the highway near Coquitlam, when a car came out of nowhere and hit me from behind. I don't remember the impact itself. I remember the appointment, the midwife telling me everything looked perfect, the baby in position, we were almost there, and then I remember white ceiling, beeping, a nurse's voice, pain. I had a fractured collarbone, 2 cracked ribs, and the baby came early by emergency cesarean section. She was small but she was breathing. They put her under observation. I lay in recovery asking for my husband over and over, and when he finally came in, he looked at me for a long moment and then looked away. I told myself he was scared. I told myself shock does strange things to people's faces. My in-laws arrived that evening. My mother-in-law stood at the edge of my room with her coat still on, like she was deciding whether or not to stay. My father-in-law shook my husband's hand. Neither of them came close to the bed. "We're glad you're all right," my mother-in-law said. Technically true, I suppose. Technically the right thing to say. I asked if they'd seen the baby. She was in the NICU, just down the hall, one of those tiny warm rooms where they keep the lights low and the nurses speak softly. My mother-in-law said, "We'll let the staff do their jobs." And then she said something about a parking situation and they left. That was the first night. The next few days blurred together. My collarbone was in a sling. I couldn't lift my daughter properly without help. The nurses showed me how to hold her with my good arm, how to feed her. She was so small. She had these tiny fingers that wrapped around mine when I gave her my hand. And I remember thinking, I will burn the whole world down before I let anyone hurt you. I didn't know yet how close to true that was going to be. My husband came and went. He was handling things. That's what he said. Handling things. He made phone calls in the hallway. He brought me a coffee once that I didn't ask for and forgot to bring me the phone charger I specifically asked for twice. On the third day, I asked him when we could go home. He got very quiet. Then he told me that his parents had offered to have us stay with them in Surrey while I recovered. That it made sense. That the condo wasn't set up for a baby and recovery, and they had space. I said that sounded fine. I thought he meant we would all go together. He said, I'll be back and forth for work. But you and the baby would be there. I said, your parents would help with the baby? He didn't answer right away. And in that pause, something cold moved through me. They think, he said carefully, that it might be better if the baby was with a nurse for a while. Just while you're recovering. They know someone who does private care. Temporary. Just to take the pressure off. I stared at him. You want to take my daughter to a stranger, I said, while I recover alone in your parents' house. He started talking about practicality, about my injuries, about how I couldn't lift her, about the cost of a private nurse, which he mentioned twice, and I noticed he didn't say we'd be splitting it or that he'd cover it. He said, we in that vague way that meant me. I told him no. He left shortly after. His parents didn't come back that day. I lay in that hospital bed that night, listening to the quiet of the ward, and I thought about the highway. The car that hit me from behind. The way my husband had looked at me when he first came into the room. The phone calls in the hallway. The offer to separate me from my daughter temporarily. And I thought about my grandmother's phone call 3 weeks before, the will, the house, the savings. I didn't let myself finish the thought. Not yet. My grandmother called the next morning. She must have felt something, the way old people sometimes do, because I hadn't told her I was in the hospital. I'd planned to call her once I was home, once things felt more settled, but she called me. When I heard her voice, I started crying. I didn't mean to. It just came out of me. She listened to everything. She didn't interrupt, didn't rush me, didn't tell me I was overreacting. When I finished, she said, I'm coming. I told her she didn't have to. Her knee, the flight from Winnipeg, she was 78 years old. She said, my granddaughter is in a hospital in Vancouver with a newborn baby and a broken collarbone, and no one sitting beside her. I'm coming. She landed the following afternoon. She walked into that room with her carry-on bag and her good coat and her reading glasses pushed up on her head, and she looked at me in the bed, and she looked at my daughter in the bassinet beside me. And she sat down in the chair and took my hand and said, tell me everything, all of it. Start at the beginning. So I did. I told her about the accident, about my husband's face when he walked in, about my mother-in-law standing at the door in her coat, about the offer to put the baby in private care, about the phone calls in the hallway. I told her about the feeling I'd been carrying around. The one I kept telling myself was just new mother paranoia, just pain medication, just fear. My grandmother sat quietly for a long time. Then she said, you said you mentioned the cost of a nurse twice. I said yes. She said, and they want you to stay in their house in Surrey. Not your condo. I said yes. She looked at me steadily. Have you talked to anyone about your grandmother's will, other than me? I said I might have mentioned it to my husband, once casually. The same week, my grandmother had told me. We were talking about the future, about the baby coming, and I'd said something about how there might be some money from my grandmother's estate eventually. I hadn't made it a big thing. I hadn't thought it was a big thing. My grandmother nodded slowly. And the accident was 2 weeks after that conversation. I felt the air go out of the room. That's a coincidence, I said. She looked at me, maybe. She didn't say anything else about it then. But she asked me for my husband's full name and the name of his parents, and she wrote them down in the small notebook she always carries. That evening my husband came by to check in. He was pleasant. He asked how I was feeling. He said hello to my grandmother. He'd always gotten along with her or pretended to, and he made small talk about her flight. She was warm, gracious, gave him nothing. After he left, she watched the door close and she said very quietly, he didn't ask about the baby once. I hadn't noticed, but she was right. She stayed at a hotel near the hospital and came every day. She held my daughter for hours while I slept. She argued with a nurse about my pain medication schedule and won. She brought me soup from a Vietnamese place on Robson Street that she'd walked 40 minutes to find because I mentioned once months ago that I loved their broth. She is, without question, the most formidable person I have ever known. On the 5th day, she came in and sat down and put her notebook on the table between us. I made some calls, she said. She had spoken to her lawyer in Winnipeg, the one who'd handled the will. She'd asked him to look into a few things. She'd also, she told me carefully, spoken to a friend of hers, a woman who'd worked in insurance investigation for 30 years before retiring. She'd described the accident. Rear-end collision on a highway, my grandmother said, near an on-ramp. You said the car came from your left and hit you from behind, at an angle. I said yes, and the police report listed it as the other driver failing to merge sebsa. The other driver had no prior accidents, clean record. The car was a rental. I hadn't known that. How did you find that out? She said her friend had ways. She didn't elaborate. A rental car. Someone who borrowed or rented a vehicle, drove it to that specific on-ramp, and hit my car at that angle. 2 weeks after I'd mentioned to my husband that I stood to inherit from my grandmother. I sat with that for a long time. I could be wrong, my grandmother said. This might be nothing, but I think you need a lawyer, sweetheart. Your own lawyer today. I called a family law firm in Vancouver that morning. My grandmother sat in the chair and held my daughter while I spoke to a lawyer named, well, I'll call her my lawyer, because she's still working for me, and some things aren't mine to share. I explained the situation, the accident, the will, the offer to separate me from my baby, the in-laws who hadn't come back, the husband who was handling things. She asked me if I had access to our joint accounts. I hadn't checked. She told me to check. I checked while she was on the phone. Our joint savings account, where we kept the emergency fund and the down payment savings for the house we'd been planning to buy, had been moved. Not emptied, that would have been too obvious, but reduced by 60% over the previous 3 weeks. Small transfers, each under the threshold that would trigger an automatic bank alert. Timed, carefully. Beginning about a week after my grandmother told me about the will, I told my lawyer. She said, don't sign anything, don't agree to anything, don't leave that hospital until we have spoken again. I said I understood. My husband came that evening. He had papers. He said his parents' lawyer had drafted something, a temporary care arrangement for our daughter while I recovered, just to make things simpler, just to relieve the stress. I was in no condition to be making decisions anyway. The baby needed stability. I'm not signing that, I said. He looked surprised. He hadn't expected that. He'd expected the woman who'd been alone in this hospital room for 5 days, in pain, exhausted, separated from everyone she trusted, to be easier to manage. My grandmother was not in the room. She had gone to get dinner. But my lawyer had given me very specific instructions, and I followed them. I think you should leave, I said. And I think you should know that I've retained a lawyer, and that I've spoken to someone about the accident. He didn't move for a moment. Then he said, Adela, you're not well. You're not thinking clearly. Leave, I said. He left. I called my grandmother's cell phone, and she was back within 20 minutes, carrying 2 containers of soup and a look on her face that told me she'd been expecting something like this. Over the following weeks, I'm going to compress this, because some of it is still moving through the court system, and there are things I can't say in detail. My lawyer and my grandmother's investigator friend pieced together what had been happening. My husband had significant business debts. His real estate career, which I'd always understood to be stable, had been bleeding money for over a year. He had a silent partner, a friend of his father's, and that partnership had gone badly wrong. There were amounts owed that I had known nothing about, because he kept separate business accounts, and I hadn't asked the right questions. The amount he owed was significant, enough that an inheritance from my grandmother, even shared through marital property, would have covered most of it. When I'd mentioned the inheritance possibility that evening at home, I don't think he'd planned anything immediately. But that seed had planted, and then his business situation had worsened, and at some point a plan had formed. The rental car was traced, eventually, to a company in Coquitlam. The person who'd rented it had used a false name and a prepaid credit card, but there was security footage at the rental office, and my grandmother's friend knew someone who knew someone, and that person looked very much like an associate of my father-in-law. That's all I can say about that part. What I can say is that the temporary care arrangement his parents' lawyer had drafted was not, in fact, temporary. Buried in the language was a clause that would have given his parents co-guardianship of my daughter during the period of my incapacitation, with renewal provisions that had no clear end date. My lawyer said she'd seen similar documents before, usually in situations where someone was trying to establish standing in a custody proceeding. They had planned to use my daughter to keep me from leaving, to keep me financially dependent, legally entangled, unable to simply walk away with my child and my grandmother's inheritance and over. I did not sign. I want to tell you there was a dramatic moment. A confrontation, a door slammed, a speech I gave that laid everything out while everyone stood listening. That's not how it happened. It happened slowly, in lawyers' offices and careful phone calls, in documents filed with the court. My husband retained his own lawyer. His parents retained separate counsel. There were negotiations that I sat through across tables from people who had once called me daughter and had not come back to see my daughter in the hospital after that first night. My mother-in-law cried in one of those meetings. Real tears, I think. I don't know if they were guilt or grief or fear of what was coming. I didn't ask. My father-in-law said nothing for most of those meetings, just watched me. Once, at the end of one particularly long session, he said, "We always liked you, Adela." He sounded almost surprised. Like he couldn't quite reconcile those two facts. I said, "I know." The rental car situation was eventually referred to the RCMP. The investigation is ongoing. I can't say more than that. The marriage ended. The financial settlement, given what my lawyer found about the business debts and the account transfers, was complex, but I had good representation and I had kept records of everything, a habit I developed at work, and that, it turns out, is extraordinarily useful in a divorce. My grandmother sat in on every meeting she could. She went back to Winnipeg eventually. Her knee was acting up again. She cried when she said goodbye to my daughter at the airport, holding her in the carrier with one hand and pressing her face to that little soft head. And she said, "You are going to be so loved, little one, so loved." She looked up at me. "Both of you." I drove home alone, to a different home now, a rental in New Westminster, with good natural light and a back garden that the landlord said I could use. My daughter was in the back seat. It was October, and the mountains were that specific shade of gray-blue they get in the fall, and the leaves were coming down on 10th Avenue, and I thought about all the things I thought my life was going to look like and how different it looked now. Different doesn't mean worse. That's what I'm still learning. I have my daughter. I have my grandmother, who calls every morning and asks about the baby's weight and sleeping schedule in a tone that suggests she's keeping detailed records, which she probably is. I have my lawyer, who is thorough and formidable, and has a coffee mug on her desk that says billable hours in small font, which I appreciate in a way I couldn't have anticipated. I have my job, which gave me extended parental leave without question, and a card signed by everyone in the office. I have a therapist I see every 2 weeks in a small office near Queensboro, and she doesn't let me minimize things, which is uncomfortable and necessary. The spare room in my rental is the nursery. I painted it a soft sage green. My grandmother's hand-knit blanket is on the crib, the same one my mother-in-law sent during the pregnancy, which I kept because it's warm, and because my daughter loves the texture, and I refuse to let anyone else's choices take things from her. There are still things I don't know. I don't know exactly what conversations happened in what order. I don't know fully who knew what and when. I probably never will. There are pieces that will stay murky, and I've had to make peace with that. What I know is this. The night I gave birth, I was alone in a way I had never been before. Alone in the specific way where you realize the people you thought were your foundation were never actually standing where you thought they were. That kind of alone changes you. And I know that the next morning, my grandmother called because she had a feeling that she bought a plane ticket within an hour of hanging up the phone, that she walked into my hospital room with her carry-on bag and her notebook, and her absolute, unshakable certainty that her granddaughter was worth showing up for. Every time I look at my daughter, I think about that, about what it means to show up, to come when it matters, to not stand at the door in your coat deciding. My daughter's middle name is the same as my grandmother's first name. She doesn't know that yet. She's 4 months old and her primary concern is whether the milk is warm enough, but someday she'll know. And I hope, when she does, she understands what I was trying to say. That love is not something you announce at a wedding toast, and then measure out carefully when things get complicated. That the people who matter are the ones who come to the hospital, even when the flight is long and the knee is bad and the situation is more complicated than they bargained for. That some people walk in when everyone else walks out. And that sometimes, one person walking in is enough to change everything.